Hi there, loyal listeners of Dirt Nap City, and welcome to another episode. Alex and I recording today. How are you, Alex?
Hey, buddy. How's it going?
Great, man. I am just kind of sitting here chilling, about ready to record with you. It's an undisclosed date in 2025, and this episode will come out on some other undisclosed date. But this is one that I think you're going to really like.
Oh, good.
Yeah. This is one. Pretty much 20th century kind of story. And this is one that I think actually kind of fits in with some of our others that we've done recently. You mentioned in a previous recording that you liked it when there was crossover.
Yeah, I like when our guys are usually guys, let's face it, get to know each other or cross paths for a second. Better for when it's just for a brief time, you know.
Yeah. Like they kind of like maybe have a little bit of influence on each other. Well,
maybe a lunch, maybe a coffee.
They stopped at Starbucks. So this episode today I want to talk about is I'm gonna pull an Alex, and I'm gonna do two people. Now, I don't know if I've done one with two people yet.
I don't think you have. No, I don't think you have.
You've done several where they've been groups or more than one person, but I've stuck to the rules. So today I'm throwing the rules out the window, chucking them out. Going to do two people, and as I said, they're 20th century people.
Well, you know what we say on this show. No rules, just right.
Just right. Yeah.
And Siskel and Ebert actually broke the mold on that.
That was the first time. Well, the Pilgrims as well.
Well, yeah, that's true.
You did that season one, but yeah, if you like stories about pairs where this is literally like Siskel and Ebert, these are two people you never think of alone. They're a combination, and I'm going to give you one clue that might just sell it. Might just tell you who it is right away.
Are they criminals?
They're brothers.
Oh, brothers. Okay. Oh, the Wright brothers.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Like when you think of brothers.
Well, my next guess was gonna be the Jackson 5. So,
well, they're not all in Dirt Nap City yet, but several of them are. True. But no, Wilbur Orville Wright. Wilbur was the older of the two. He was born in 1867, and Orville was the younger, born in 1871. They were brothers. They were inventors. Really, truly American heroes, I think, in a lot of ways.
And I'm fascinated by that space. The race for flight, and how in less than 100 years we got to the moon. I think that's cool.
It is absolutely amazing. I mean, their first flight was 1903, but what is kind of interesting about that? People were flying before the Wright brothers. They weren't the first to fly. Do you know what differentiated them and made them so important?
I didn't actually know that. I thought they were the first to fly.
Oh no, sure. There were balloons before that. Oh
yeah. Well, you've told us about Zeppelins and balloons. I thought you meant in a plane. Yeah, you're right.
There were gliders. They were unpowered. It was definitely something that, as a matter of fact, there was a guy in Germany named Otto Lilienthal who had been doing glider flight since the mid-1800s and writing articles about it. And he was a big inspiration for the Wright brothers.
Whenever they show those old black and white movies of people attempting flight, I always like the guy with the giant bird wings.
And he jumps off the building and falls.
He's flapping as hard as he can. But those things are so big, there's no way he could possibly get flight.
Here's the thing. You really kind of hit the nail on the head. The problem before the Wrights was everybody focused on the wrong stuff. People thought that in order to fly, you had to have the the framework or the sort of physical shape of a bird. That was what people were going for. And the Wrights quickly realized that was not really the case. Like, they took inspiration from birds, but it wasn't something that they didn't try to mimic a bird like that guy you just described, all the old pictures. But they were also just amazingly focused and had this incredible work ethic. They just made people inspired by them later. They became national heroes in the U.S. and internationally, actually. In France, they were really big. In Germany, they were really big. But their big thing was They were the first people to make a controlled, sustained flight with an engine in a heavier than air aircraft. That was in 1903, December 17th. And that's where it was different. It was controlled, meaning that they could actually steer the thing. It was powered, meaning that it had a motor, because people had been doing gliding before. The Wright brothers had been doing gliding before, and it was heavier than air. It wasn't a blimp with, you could control airships and blimps up to that point. Nobody had done it with something that weighed more than the air did, which with hydrogen or helium, it's lighter than air. So that was really their big differentiator. You know where that took place, right?
Yeah, Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, Kitty Hawk.
Kitty Hawk, on the Outer Banks.
I've been there, man. I've been to that spot of land where they did that, and it is windy out there.
Yeah, and that's part of why they picked it. But let's back up for a minute before we get into that. I want to just kind of back you up to their youth and how they were raised. They were born to Milton Wright and Susan Catherine Corner. Now, Milton was a clergyman, and they were 4 years apart. As I said, Wilbur was the older, 1867. He was born, and Orville was 1871, so 4 years apart. And they had actually a couple of brothers, a guy named Roykin and Lauren, and then they had a sister named Catherine. Now, have you heard of Catherine at all? Catherine Wright?
I don't know. It doesn't ring a bell.
At the time, she actually became almost as famous as they were because they were bachelors and they lived with their father and their sister for many, many years. And so she became somebody that people looked up to when they became famous because she was almost like their PR agent. Really? She would go with them and arrange things for them and kind of manage their stars. But together, the Wright brothers, the two that we're talking about, not the other two that weren't really involved, Orville and Wilbur, they were called Will and Orv. That was their friend, how their friends knew them. And a lot of people in Dayton, Ohio called them the Bishop's Boys.
That's where they lived, Dayton?
Dayton, Ohio. It's where they were from, yeah. Now, the Bishop's Boys, doesn't that sound like an English ska band?
Yeah, yeah, it definitely sounds like some hoodlums from Manchester or something. Yeah,
right. But that's what they were called, the Bishop's Boys, and their father was as I said, he was a clergyman, and he very much raised them as religious, but also progressive, because a lot of religious people back then didn't like to read books. They didn't believe in science. They thought it was an affront to God. Their father actually brought them a toy helicopter in 1873. And when I say toy helicopter, this was a stick with paper and a rubber band that would twirl, and it would fly kind of, like those little sticks that you can twirl and spin and they fly for a few seconds.
Mm-hmm.
It was like that. And Wilbur and Orville played with it just nonstop. It was something that they really enjoyed. As a matter of fact, they eventually broke it, and they ended up fixing it, modifying it, and making it fly even better. And they both credit that toy with being their first sort of fascination with flight. But yeah, these were the kind of things their father would do. Is he would have them read books. He would teach them about science. He also thought that women should have rights. Their father was very progressive for his day, saying, believed in women's rights, opposed slavery. And so the Wrights were a little more tolerant of other people than some white people were back then. And so, kind of raised in a way that was perfect for who they would become eventually.
This is great. So this means that there's not going to be a turn where you tell me that these guys were like pedophiles or anything like that.
No. They were pretty stand-up guys. There was a little bit of controversy here and there that we'll get into, but for the most part, they were pretty stand-up. Now, in 1886, Wilbur was playing hockey with a guy named Oliver Crook Haw. And first of all, who gives their son a middle name Crook?
Yeah, that's pretty hardcore.
Well, Wilbur lost his teeth. This incident actually, Wilbur had been a pretty outgoing, ambitious person. He had planned to go to Yale, actually. So this sidelined him because he lost his teeth. He ended up being housebound for a while. took care of his mother at that time because she had tuberculosis. But I want to talk a minute before we get on about Wilbur and how he recovered. I want to talk about Oliver Crook Haw. So Oliver Crook Haw was a resident of Dayton. He was considered the Dayton bully. And even though he was 3 years younger than Wilbur, he was in between Wilbur and Orville's age. He was kind of a bully. They're not sure if he hit Wilbur on purpose during this hockey game or not, but he did knock his teeth out. But he later actually became a doctor, this Oliver Crook Haw, and he became addicted to cocaine because a lot of medicine back then had cocaine. He became obsessed with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the book by Robert Louis Stevenson, and he started to believe that you could have two beings in one body. Now, while this is going on, Oliver Crook Haw from Dayton got married. Guess how many times he was married?
I don't know, 3?
9 times.
Oh, yeah. Well,
got married 9 times.
At some point, you got to look in the mirror, right?
Some of his wives died mysteriously. As a matter of fact, 4 of them did, which I think is actually one more than Henry VIII killed. I think Henry VIII. I was going to say. Yeah. He also had patients. As I said, he was a doctor. He had patients that died mysteriously as well. So lots of weird stuff going on. He eventually found out, Oliver Crook Haw found out that he was cut out of his parents' will. And shortly thereafter, in 1905, his parents' house caught fire, killing his parents and his brother. And he was eventually put to death for that crime in 1907. He was executed by the electric chair, Oliver Crook Haw. But
the only thing he has to do with this story is that he knocked out Orville's teeth?
No, Wilbur's teeth. The older brother. He knocked out Wilbur's teeth. He altered Wilbur's life so much that he's kind of sometimes partially credited with driving Wilbur the direction he went. Like Wilbur stayed home and he took care of his mother. And then in 1889, his mother, Wilbur, the family's mother died, Susan, in 1889. And at that point, Orville was still in high school. Wilbur had dropped out and was, living at home with his teeth knocked out, doing better. And Orville actually decided to start a printing press, or a printing business. And so the brothers built a printing press on their property, and they started printing a weekly newspaper called the West Side News in Dayton. Orville was the publisher. Wilbur was the editor. Now, did you know that they were printers before they were bicycle makers?
No. Wait, how old were they at this point?
Well, Orville dropped out of high school to do this. So he was, 18, 17, something like that. And Wilbur was 4 years older, so maybe 20. They started this paper called the West Side News, and then they changed it to a daily paper called the Evening Item. And then they actually started publishing or printing for other people who wanted printing. So they became like a printer for hire. And one of their first clients was a guy named Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was an African-American poet and writer who was actually pretty famous at the time. And Dunbar came to work for them, publishing another paper that they put out. This one was great. It was called the Dayton Tattler.
I like that name for a paper.
Yeah, I feel like that's been done a few times, but the Tattler. Anyway, they did their printing from 1889 for about 3 years until 1892. And then guess what happened in the 1890s? We talked about this in another episode recently. The bicycle craze.
Oh, yeah, the bicycle craze.
That was the time. And do you know why the bicycle craze happened?
Was it because rubber got cheap to make?
No, it was because somebody invented what they call the safety bicycle. Now, have you heard of the safety bicycle?
No.
Okay. So we've talked, I think, before, and I've threatened before also to do an episode of Dead End about penny farthing.
Several times you've threatened that.
Yeah. Well, it all comes back to penny farthers. Penny farthers were those giant front wheel, small back wheel bikes. Right. Very dangerous, very easy to tip over. If you hit the brakes and your weight was forward, you would what they call endoing, where you go over the front wheel and smash your face. Well, the safety bicycle was a bicycle with 2 wheels that were the same size, and this was done through gearing. You were able to actually pedal because there was a chain and the gears were different sizes, and it would allow you to go faster than just, if you pedaled the wheel itself. The reason the penny farthers had such giant wheels is because pedaling that giant wheel would give you speed with very little effort. You only had to pedal one rotation, but the circumference of that wheel was so big that as you rolled, you went a good distance for each pedal stroke. Anyway, the safety bicycle came along.
But the penny farther was perfect for those dresses that had the big butts.
Oh yeah, the hoops. That's true. There's nothing like a woman in a dress on a penny farther. Been
waiting for that trend to come back.
And it will. Well, in 1892, the brothers opened a repair shop to take advantage of this craze that was going on in Dayton with bicycles and the safety bicycles. And it was called the Wright Cycle Company. And in 1896, they actually started designing and building their own bicycles. So, you've mentioned before in a couple of episodes about machinists and electrical engineers and people who can do all kinds of things with wood and, just people who can build stuff. These guys were that. The Wright brothers were able to fabricate and build their own bicycles, and it actually became very popular. They had two models. The Van Cleve, which is an awesome name for a bicycle.
Sure.
Was named after the Wright brothers' great-great-grandmother, who was one of Dayton's first settlers. And it was a racing bicycle. And then they had the St. Clair, which was the more affordable bicycle, named after the first governor of the Northwest Territory, which included Ohio, Arthur St. Clair. Well, while they're doing all these bicycles, there's a whole bunch of people out there that are still trying to figure out flight. And this is, the 1890s. There's still Otto Lilienthal, who was a German who had been doing all these gliding experiments and publishing articles about it. There was a guy named Samuel Langley, who was actually employed by the Smithsonian Institute and using government money to try. He actually tried to create a steam-powered aircraft. Remember how we talked about steam was impractical for a car? Yeah. Imagine trying to put it on an airplane. It didn't work very well. A guy named Octave Chanute, and he was doing experiments with gliders in Michigan. But what really happened to get them to go into doing all these experiments in aviation was, first of all, Samuel Langley was able to actually build a steam-powered fixed-wing model aircraft. Now, it didn't carry a human, but it was a model that would fly on its own power using steam. And then Octave Chanute was doing all these tests in the U.S., and he was one of the first people in the United States to do all these tests on gliders out on the shores of Lake Michigan. And then, tragically, this was all in 1896, the German guy, Otto Lilienthal, died. And the brothers actually took that news kind of hard. He was kind of a hero to them because he had been writing, publishing, doing research. As a matter of fact, Wilbur said, Lilienthal was without question the greatest of the precursors, and the world owes him a great deal of debt.
So did they consider this stuff to be dangerous before that? Or
Yes, okay. It was. People died trying to build aircraft, not only from falling, but there were cases where, for instance, and this happened to the Wrights a couple of times, a propeller would break and it would send shards of shrapnel flying everywhere. Yeah. Or a motor would blow a piston and it would, this is the early 1900s. Cars weren't even that popular or, well established at that point. Well, as I said, Otto Lilienthal had made hundreds of flights, and the big thing that he did differently was, and this was with a non-powered aircraft, a glider, he would use his weight to steer the glider. That was kind of his innovation. But what's interesting about it is most of the Americans, this Samuel Langley, who was part of the Smithsonian, and Octave Chanute, they were not worried about controlling the aircraft. All they wanted to do was get something in the air that was perfectly level, that would not bank or roll. It would just stay level and just fly. That's all they were trying to do. The Wrights really were some of the first people to understand that in order to control an aircraft, Well, first of all, in order to fly, you had to control the aircraft. You couldn't just set it in a straight line and hope for the best or use your weight. They realized that was impractical. They observed birds. They were always watching birds. They did that in Dayton. They did that in Kitty Hawk. They were always watching the birds, and they realized that birds don't stay level and turn like a ship, just with yaw. They roll, right? They kind of roll in the wind. They curve. They go sideways. And that was a revolutionary idea back then. Nobody had thought about that. As a matter of fact, you know where part of their inspiration came from that? Not just birds, but their other business.
Bicycles?
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about a bicycle, you really can't make a right-hand turn unless you're going very slowly and very deliberately. It's very hard to turn without banking.
Right. Yeah.
And motorcycles as well, but at the time It was bicycles. So this was like a big aha moment from them. Everybody had been thinking about yaw, and yaw is the left and right. And everybody had kind of been thinking about pitch because that's what a dirigible or a blimp would do, or a Zeppelin. They would pitch straight up. They would go up. They would level out. And if they wanted to turn, they would just yaw like a boat. They wouldn't roll at all. That was not what they did. So this was a new thing for a combination of pitch, yaw, and roll. Nobody had thought of that before.
I was on a flight one time, and there's a thing on modern planes called a yaw damper. And that's what keeps it from like fishtailing back and forth. It just keeps it in line. And the pilot came on and he said, folks,
in that calming voice.
Yeah. He said, our yaw damper is broken. And he said that it's completely safe, but this is going to be unpleasant for everybody for the next hour. And we definitely just were like going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The back of the plane, the yaw was just going. There was nothing to keep it in place. We were basically like a salmon going upriver, just back and
the
forth. The
tail was just whipping. Yeah.
Oh my God. And it was just the wind that was taking us, I guess, back and forth. It was so unpleasant, but he was very reassuring. And he was like, I'm just telling you that this is how small planes are. It's not a big deal. It's actually kind of fun to fly this way, but I'm really sorry. It's so uncomfortable. It was a beautiful day, and he was very reassuring, but I'll never forget that term, yaw damper.
Yeah, yaw damper. That'd be a good name for a band.
Yeah, for sure.
Or at least a song. Well, no, you are absolutely right. That was the problem people were having, was as they would try to turn the aircraft, it was very difficult to turn the aircraft just using a rudder, right? It wasn't a ship. And so one of the first things that the Wrights did was they came up with this idea of wing warping. And what happened is Wilbur Wright was opening a box that had come to the bicycle shop. And you know how if you have a square box, particularly kind of a long, almost tube, but it's not round, it's square, but it's kind of long and thin, you can kind of warp it. You can grab the two sides and kind of like twist it, and it'll flip back to its original shape. Mm-hmm. That's what he was doing. And he realized he could do that with the wings. And that by doing that with the wings, if they were elastic enough, they would flip back to their original shape. But that's what birds do. If you watch slow motion of a bird flying, it will warp its wings in such a way that the wind passes over it, it rolls, and then it uses its tail as a rudder to kind of keep it level and yaw dampen.
And if you're always thinking about flight, just the smallest thing, like, messing with a box is going to put that in your head. Like, you have to be obsessed like that. Yeah.
They were so obsessed with flight. So in 1900, they had written a letter to Octave Chanute, the guy who had been doing the flying in Michigan, and asked him, like, why did you pick that location? What's ideal for testing flights? And Octave Chanute wrote back and said, well, you need steady wind and you need a soft place to land, like sand. Sand is ideal. So Octave Chanute suggested several places in the U.S. that he thought would work: Florida, California. But it turned out, after some investigation with the Weather Bureau, that Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, was also very conducive to these flight tests, and it was a lot closer than Florida or California or Michigan. So they decided in 1900 to go to Kitty Hawk. They brought a glider with them, and the first couple of things they did they didn't even have a person on them. They were just like a kite, and they tested their wing warping. So they would tie ropes down, and they were very secretive about it. By the way, they did not let a lot of people know that this was going on. They didn't want anybody to steal their ideas, and they also weren't fame seekers. They really didn't care about being famous. They just wanted to figure out how to fly. So they go out in 1900 to Kitty Hawk, and they started to do these tests with this biplane. And you know what I mean by biplane?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Two wings.
Mm-hmm.
Two wings stacked on top of each other. But it was a kite. And they learned how to make the wings warp and how to control the roll of it. And that was their first step.
What kind of material was that made out of?
It was made of spruce and muslin.
No, I mean the kite part.
Spruce and muslin.
That's muslin,
Yeah. Muslin was kind of the cloth that was, I guess, rigid enough to, have some air, push the air over it, but also supple enough or stretchy enough that you could stretch it over a spruce frame. So on October 20th, after they had been out at Kitty Hawk for a while, they actually discovered Kill Devil Hills. Like they had not been at that exact point, but they realized these were sand dunes that were 100 feet high. So you said you've been there.
Have you been there?
No, but I'm curious.
It's
Are
so
the sand
cool.
dunes still 100 feet high?
Probably not 100 feet high. No, they've probably been eroded, but it's just so windy. Everything there, like you can't talk to the person next to you. It's just wind.
Wow.
Probably. My guess is it's always like that.
Sand blowing up in your face too.
Kind of, yeah. But it's right on the water. Yeah, it's really cool.
They certainly had a lot of setbacks with weather, with wind, and even getting out there was kind of difficult because at the time there wasn't a bridge. I think they had to take a boat out because it's these are Outer Banks, right? So these are all little islands, little barrier islands on the coast.
I don't think it's an island. It was right on the coast. It's right on the beach. I mean, it's just a very windy coastal place. But I don't remember like doing any kind of tour or anything like that. I just remember going out there and see. I'm sure there was something, but I don't think we did
A marker or something. How many years ago did you go?
Maybe like probably 30 years ago.
Oh, wow. Well, no, I would love to check it out, especially after having read all these stories. So this was their first time out there. After they had done their tests with the kite, they actually, Wilbur got into a glider, and he did about 20 free glides on the Kill Devil Hills. And you know how they didn't sit in these things, right? It was a little different back then. Do you ever seen how they were positioned?
Not close up, no.
So they would lay. It was a biplane. This glider he was trying, and they would lay on their stomach. And at that time, they were just using their weight to shift, and the weight when they shifted would allow the wings to warp to do the turning. And they originally thought they could then, like, kind of their legs were kind of dangling off the back of the wing. They thought they could kind of bend their legs and stand up to land, but they realized with some skids on the bottom of these gliders, they could actually land by just sliding on the sand. Jeez. And so they basically came up with that idea, and for 5 years, that was how they flew. So this was 1900. They learned a lot after being out there. They went back in 1901, and this time they brought a lot more materials. They built a workshop and a hangar. They were living in tents, but they had to kind of have all the tools and all the materials and all the wood and all the rope and all the metal and everything out there that they needed to fix these planes. And in 1901, they had a glider that would go 400 feet.
So I wonder what they considered flying, like what their definition was. It couldn't be gravity or the wind or their own like momentum that was carrying, right? It had to be powered by the thing that they were like. What's their definition of flying?
These are still gliders. So they're still doing tests in 1901. So flying at this point, I think, was to leave the ground, to be able to control it, and to, I mean, I think, the moment you leave the ground and the wind is lifting the wings into the air, you're flying. So flying was actually not the hard part. They could get up in the air. They just, it was the control, right? It was the ability to control. It was the ability to not go too high, not to crash into the ground. And this second year, they had some long flights, like I said, 400 feet. So imagine, a football field and a third. That's a pretty long distance. But they were having a lot of problems because sometimes the thing would kind of whip around the wrong way. It didn't have at this point, it didn't have a rudder. They didn't have a rudder on it. It was like, imagine two big wings in the front and one small wing in the back, but no vertical stabilizer, like no vertical rudder sticking up. And even though they had some good flights, Wilbur was pretty dejected. He felt like they were not making the progress he hoped they would, and he commented to Orville that he didn't think man would fly for 1,000 years during this trip.
Wow.
They noted that. But guess what they did when they got back? This was something nobody had ever done before. They built a wind tunnel in their bicycle shop. Now, you've seen these tests of vehicles, cars in a wind tunnel where you see the smoke going over it. This was a very crude version of that. Have you, what do you think of when you think of wind tunnel?
Yeah, like aerodynamics, right?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out aerodynamics and jet stream and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, guess what they used to power the wind tunnel?
Horses?
A bicycle. They hooked a bicycle wheel up, and one of them would pedal, and it would turn a fan, and that fan would create the wind that would flow. And then they were using pieces of hacksaws. They had these metal hacksaws that they were using to actually test the pitch. It was mostly about the pitch. Now, one other thing that a lot of people don't realize is how the lift of a wing works. Do you have any thoughts on how a wing works to lift?
Is there something called the Bernoulli effect? Is that a thing?
I think that's with water.
Is it?
Maybe it's, but what would that mean?
It's about lift, right? That there's lift under the wing. The wind kind of lifts, it goes under the wing.
Actually, the opposite. So the way a good wing is designed, it's flatter on the bottom and curved on the top, and so the wind goes faster on the bottom and slower on the top. And by going slower, it creates a tiny little vacuum. Like basically, because the wind is moving slower, somehow that creates a vacuum. And the way a vacuum works, it tries to suck in whatever is there. It's so it isn't actually the wind pushing up from the bottom of the wing, it's pulling up from the top of the wing. It's that slower air moving over the top of the wing that causes lift.
And they figured that out with the wind tunnel.
Yeah. People had sort of known this before, but most wings at that time were flat. They didn't have that curve to it. They also realized that, you remember I was talking about Otto Lilienthal, the glider guy from Germany? He had written a whole bunch of formulas and calculations. Turns out they were wrong.
I was going to say, physicists must have been learning all this stuff simultaneously, but you're not getting that stuff down to the bike makers, and the physicists weren't making planes. So they could have talked to each other.
Yeah.
And maybe saved 30 years on this stuff. Right?
Well, that's the thing about the Wright brothers is they were both. They could do the math, they could do the engineering, they could actually physically build the stuff, and then they had the guts.
Doers. They
had the guts to go out and actually try it, right?
Yeah,
and put their their lives at risk.
It's cool that they were brothers, because you figure one person doing this might not be able to do this all himself. It just probably takes two to do something.
Yeah, like a podcast.
Equally committed. Yeah.
I mean, imagine listening to just me for an hour. That would be tragic. But with Alex jumping in, it's entertaining.
We could release versions where you just cut the other person out.
Yeah, just mute one audio track, and it could be like a DIY podcast where the listener gets to insert their own things. They get to say their own things.
For the Patreon people, we'll offer that.
So in 1902, they went out and they had learned so much from this, this wind tunnel that they had built, and they went out and they immediately started flying. They were at this point flying 600 feet. So, almost double what they had done the year before. They flew over 1,000 flights with their glider in 1902. Now, still no power. But this is the point at which they demonstrated lift, control, stability, all those things. They kind of had that down. Now it was time to turn to power. And so,
were they ever given other people rides on this? Or was
not
it
yet.
Just the two of them?
Not yet. It was the
not
two
even
of them.
Catherine.
They did have. Well, even Catherine wasn't really involved at this point. She never came out to Kitty Hawk. She was a teacher, and she was teaching back in Dayton, kind of holding down the house and taking care of their father since their mother was dead. But they wrote very often. And, you just mentioned, too, about it being brothers, how great that was. They were famous for having disagreements but having civil disagreements, having disagreements where they might yell at each other for a minute, but then they would sometimes, they're said to have actually, each of them would change their mind and take the other's opinion and then argue again.
Yeah, I feel like if I had a brother, that's how we would be.
Yeah, well, you got a brother here.
So they're still disagreeing.
Yes.
They've taken the other points, yeah.
And to the point where everything gets better. They're disagreeing with a purpose. They're not disagreeing because of ego. They're disagreeing to try and make the best product possible or, solve the problem.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So in 1903, in March, before they went back out to Kitty Hawk while they were in Dayton, they actually applied for a patent for a flying machine based on their 1902 glider. And a lot of people say that at this point, they were further along than anybody had ever been, despite the fact that they didn't have power. They were still just gliding. It was a very significant thing because, again, they had discovered the ability to control the aircraft, which people hadn't been able to do up to this point. So in 1903, they built the Wright Flyer. It was made of spruce and muslin to cover it. They carved their own propellers, which, I mean, imagine, and these were big propellers. I mean, these were, the size of a man. These things were pretty huge, 4, 5, 6 feet.
Like those big ass fans, those big ceiling fans.
Yeah, the big ass fans. Yeah. But they were made of wood, so they had to be carved, they had to be machined, they had to be smooth. And the propellers, even though they seem very simple, propellers are actually pretty complicated. Like they're pretty hard to get just the right pitch and the right curve so that they have maximum efficiency. As a matter of fact, some people in modern time had taken some of the Wright brothers' designs for propellers, recreated them, and did efficiency tests. And their efficiency was like 78% or something, which was unheard of at that time. So they ended up building the Wright Flyer. It was a machine that was 40 feet with wingspan, had a 40-foot wingspan. It weighed 605 pounds. It had a aluminum based engine, which was unusual back then. The engine block was aluminum for lightweight. And let's guess how many horsepower it was. Any guesses?
Ooh, okay. I'm gonna say maybe 12 horsepower.
Dude, that's exactly right.
Really?
Cool. Well done. Yeah. Did you look that up?
No.
12 horsepower.
No, I was just going by what we were talking about in the Henry Ford episode.
You got it. You got it.
Yeah.
So the Flyer cost about $1,000 to create back then, which was in 1903, $1,000 is the equivalent of about $35,000 today. There's also this guy, I mentioned him earlier, and he was associated with the Smithsonian, named Samuel Langley. He had spent $50,000 in government money up to this point to build an airplane, and was not nearly as successful. So the Wrights did it with $1,000 and Samuel Langley of their own money, and Samuel Langley spent $50,000 in government money
because he didn't have a brother.
Yeah, and I guess there was no Doge department back then to look into these things. So anyway, so they went back to Kitty Hawk in 1903, and again, very secretive. There were only actually about 5 people out there with them. So they had the 2 brothers and 5 other guys that they trusted to go out there, and they went to Kill Devil Hills. And first day they broke a propeller, and so that took them a few days to get fixed. And then it happened that the day they fixed it was late on a Saturday. Well, guess what? They're religious. They don't work on Sundays. So they took Sunday off, even though it was like a perfect day to fly. And then on December 17th, they finally did their first flight. Now, what's really cool about it is the brothers had the foresight to bring a camera out there. And there is a picture of that first flight, the very first flight. It's a real picture. It's not a recreation or anything, which blows my mind. The guy who took it had no idea. He'd never operated a camera before, and they just said when Wilbur gets to here, squeeze the bulb. It was one of those squeeze things. You squeezed a little rubber thing that would trigger the camera, and he got it perfectly. And so it's a really famous picture. So they were able to have several powered flights, but the longest of which that day was 852 feet, which is almost 3 football fields.
Yeah.
And it lasted 59 seconds. And it was, that was considered the first powered, controlled, heavier than air flight by a human. And unfortunately, on the landing, they broke the rudder. The rest of the plane was okay, but they ended up they basically gave up at that point. This was December. It was very cold. It was very windy.
What year was this?
1903.
And how high did they go?
I think on that first flight, maybe 10, 20 feet.
Okay.
They were very cautious about not wanting to go too high. They were trying to keep it low enough so that if there was a catastrophe, it wouldn't kill them.
Yeah.
So they ended up breaking the Wright Flyer, and they shipped it home. And unfortunately, it actually never flew again. They didn't bother to repair it. They had so many ideas on how to make it better. They just built a new one. But that plane was repaired by Orville in 1948. No, it was repaired by Orville years later. And in 1948, it was put in the Smithsonian Institute. Where
I think I've seen that. Yeah, it's like hanging over everything, right? Yeah,
that's the original one, rebuilt after the crash. Well, after this flight, they were pretty ecstatic. They kind of thought, we did it. They telegraphed their father back in Dayton, said, inform the press, and they left a bunch of, they sent a bunch of information. Well, guess what? First of all, the press in Dayton and most of the press said, nah, it's not far enough. You didn't fly far enough to be impressive. And they ended up running the story in like the 3rd page next to the farm news or something. And then another newspaper picked up the story. And this is one of those cases of like telephone where, one person tells a story to another. And the story got published in Virginia. And then eventually again in Dayton, the same story got published, and it was all wrong. They said that the Wrights had flown 10 miles and that they had gone way up in the sky and all this other stuff that wasn't right. So literally not right. And so it kind of, it was kind of a wah-wah moment, if you know what I mean. Comedy horn, wah-wah-wah. But that's okay. They built the Wright Flyer 2 in 1904, and they decided now that they could control it a little bit better, they had a little more confidence that they were going to stay closer to home. They actually rented a field from a guy named Torrance Huffman. Torrance Huffman was a bank president. He owned some land, and he basically told them they could fly there for free as long as they didn't hit the cows. And so they ended up doing several flights out at Huffman Prairie, is what it was called, in the Flyer 2. And they were pretty careful. Again, they didn't want too many people to see it and to steal their idea, so they really tried to keep it low. But unfortunately, the Huffman Prairie was close to a train station, and so people would be going by in the train and seeing this airplane up in the air. And so word got out, and people started coming out to see to see this flight, to see this thing. I mean, think about it. Nobody had seen a man do this before, any person, right?
Yeah.
So at this point, this is 1904. They're starting to do things like circles. And I know that doesn't sound that impressive, but doing a circle in an airplane, whoa, it would circle the field. And at one point in 1904, on September 20th, Wilbur did a complete circle and covered 4,000 feet, almost a mile, in a minute and a half.
Wow.
So he's cruising along. They started doing more and more flights, but even at this point, they didn't have a lot of time in the air because these flights were very short. They started giving demos. Reporters would show up and they would start to do these flights for reporters. So people started to write things up. They started publicizing and printing things in Scientific America and other articles like that. And pretty soon they got this idea that, this is pre-World War I, but they started to think about, could we sell this to the government? Would this be something that the government would want to use? So they had several people from the U.S. military, Department of War, and some British officers came out, and also some French officers came out in 1905, saw the observation, and basically the Americans said, you know what, this is not going to work until you can do all these things. They set up all these barriers and said, we're not interested until you can prove it can do this. It can stay in the air for an hour. It can fly for more than X number of miles. It can carry 2 people. Well, Wilbur and Orville weren't ready for that. They hadn't accomplished all those things yet, but the French were very interested, and they ended up going to France. And they were there. Wilbur actually went over to France and did a ton of different flights for the French over the course of about a 9-month period. He stayed in Paris. He traveled around in France, and he gave these demo flights to Parisians. Now, at this time, they actually had built a second seat. They could sit up instead of lying on their stomachs, and they were able to take passengers up. And so they were doing these flights in France. The French military paid money for these planes, and they founded their aircraft company.
Wow.
This was something that
so that became a European company before it was a U.S. company.
No, they founded it in the U.S. and
okay.
they exported these. Their planes, the Wright Flyer, they exported them to France initially. I just find it interesting that the U.S. didn't jump on this, and kind of made them jump through all these hoops to try and sell it to them.
Yeah.
I mean, this was all still experimental.
But were they looking at it? Were we looking at it as a war machine potentially, or for transportation for the public? How were they billing it?
It was going to be more of a war machine, but not really. I think initially it was thought of as more of a reconnaissance thing, kind of like the Zeppelins were back then. They were looking at this as a way that people could go observe the enemy and see what was going on.
Well, to be fair, if you're only 10 feet off the ground, you do have some work to do.
Oh, no. By this time, they're going hundreds of feet.
Okay.
By this time, they're flying hundreds of feet in the air. They were able to basically convince the French government first that it was a useful thing. And by that time, they came back. And when they came back from France, a lot of people had heard about this. This was all taking place in Le Mans, which I think is a famous racing place now, right?
Yeah, it's where they have the 24-hour race, yeah.
Okay. Well, this was outside of Paris in Le Mans. A lot of people saw it. A lot of people heard about it. Pictures were taken. Although they tried to discourage that, they often would go into the audience and break cameras of people who weren't authorized to take pictures, it was said, or take them away. They were gentlemen up to a point. And while this is going on, their sister eventually quit her job as a teacher, and Wilbur had been in France first. Catherine and Orville came over to France, and they were all treated like heroes. So they did this entire tour. Catherine had never been out of the country before, and I don't think Orville had either. And so this was like this big moment for them where there are these Americans, and a lot of people were just impressed by their humility, impressed by the fact that they weren't fancy. They were very just down to earth. They didn't seem to be rich or snooty or anything like that. They were just people that everyone could relate to, and the French loved that at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things happened. They came back to the United States and they applied for a couple of patents. They had more trouble getting the patents in the United States than they did in France. Again, they were able to publish or file patents in France more easily than in the U.S. They also went on a tour around the U.S. doing more of these flights. And at this time, there was a guy named Glenn Curtiss. You ever heard that name, Glenn Curtiss?
Mm-mm.
So Glenn Curtiss was another aviator who had worked with some other companies and had worked with several other inventors. Glenn Curtiss had actually, I think, worked with that guy Langley, who was trying to create the plane for Smithsonian. They were going to have a race. So Glenn Curtiss and Wilbur Wright were going to race planes down the Hudson River in New York as an exhibition. And this was all to celebrate, I guess it was like the 100th year anniversary of the steamship or something like that. I forget what it was. It was some big celebration that was happening in New York City. They invited the Wright brothers to come out. They invited Glenn Curtiss to come out, and they were going to do this flight down the Potomac River. Or no, the Hudson. Hudson River. So the day they were supposed to fly, the weather was really bad, and they didn't fly. And that was one thing also that the Wright brothers were kind of sticklers for. They would not fly if the conditions weren't right. They didn't care how many kings or presidents or movie starlets or whatever were sitting in the audience. They would shut it down. And people would come out to watch them fly and be disappointed because they wouldn't fly because of the weather.
Yeah. Safety first.
Think about it. Would you, if you knew that there were thousands of people waiting to see you do something and the conditions were iffy, would you still do it?
No, man. Safety first.
Okay. I don't know. I don't know if I would. I feel like I might throw caution to the wind, so to speak, in those situations.
I think even the Wallendas preach that, ironically.
Safety first?
Yeah.
Until they didn't, right?
Well,
we're not going to use a net, but safety first. So they, as part of this celebration, they had Glenn Curtiss and Wilbur Wright. They were going to do this flight, kind of a race down the Hudson River. The weather was bad. Glenn Curtiss actually had another obligation somewhere else, and so he ended up leaving. And the next day, without any announcement, Wilbur Wright got into his airplane and flew from Governor Island around the Statue of Liberty and back.
Oh, that's awesome.
Supposedly, this was the largest number of people that had ever seen a flight because millions of people came out onto the rooftops, and he was up in the air for like 50 minutes or something like that. And it was kind of windy. It was a little bit risky for him, not something he would have originally done, but he did it. And it was kind of one of those moments. And there's actually a picture, you can Google it and find it. It's amazing, of Wilbur Wright circling the Statue of Liberty in the Wright Flyer.
Cool.
Pretty awesome stuff. At this point, they have a flying school that they've created where they're teaching pilots how to fly. They have their aircraft company that they're selling airplanes to different people. They actually kind of took maybe a plan from Henry Ford and called one of their flights the Wright Flyer Model E. They started naming them after letters.
Sure.
And they are just big time celebrities, as is Catherine. And this is allowing them to, first of all, live a little bit better life. They had been in their same house as bachelors with their sister and their father. And they ended up buying a piece of land. They were going to build a bigger house outside of Dayton, a little further out of town. And unfortunately, while this was all going on, a couple things were happening. First of all, there were all kinds of legal fights going on. People were fighting them about their patents, and they were fighting people about patent infringement. Can you imagine what a Wild West it was back then as far as building airplanes?
Seriously, yeah. Every little part was probably patented.
Once everybody had seen their airplane and it was kind of public knowledge, people started building airplanes. Like companies were popping up all over, and they were actually infringing on their copyrights or their patents. And so what happened is Wilbur got very involved in these patent infringement suits. They were suing people, and this was all stuff they didn't really want to be doing. As a matter of fact, they got it into it with Chanute, the guy who had originally been one of their fans and friends, who had told them about flying in the wind and sandy areas. They got into a scuffle with him. They got into a scuffle with Glenn Curtis. They got into a scuffle with a bunch of people because they were actually in the right in most cases. The rights were actually just defending what was theirs, but they realized that this was, it's just going to be a uphill battle. Kind of, this is one of those things where everybody wants to build an airplane, and now you've got to fight all these people.
Sure.
They actually got into it with the Smithsonian even. The Smithsonian was still using their technology to try and build airplanes. Well, this took a big toll on Wilbur, and Wilbur unfortunately got sick in 1912. He returned to Dayton after he had been on a trip to Boston, and then he got sick again, and guess what he got?
Typhoid?
Yep. He got typhoid fever, and it was something that he kind of would get better and then he would get worse. And on May 30th, 1912, he died. Wilbur did. Now think about it. Just 9 years before that, less than 9 years before that, is when he had taken the first flight, first powered flight. And all the stress of it just kind of killed him.
Yeah, he was a young guy too, huh?
Yeah, I guess he was 45 years old at that point, and had just kind of, become what he had hoped to be. Now, upon his death, Orville took over the Wright Company, and he was awarded all kinds of medals and honors. He was able to continue to fly. And that's, there's actually another kind of ironic thing. Orville had been in, both of the brothers had been in some crashes, particularly at Huffman, the Huffman Prairie flights. They had some pretty bad crashes. As a matter of fact, one resulted in a passenger's death. They had a military guy flying with them, and I think it was Orville that crashed, and the other guy died. So there was a period of time where neither of them flew for a while, and then Wilbur died, and then Orville did go back to flying. So Orville was able to see what happened with aviation through World War I and World War II, and he died in 1948. And so, he had a much longer life than his brother, I guess into his 70s, but he got kind of withdrawn during his last years and actually got into a scrap with his sister, Catherine, who had been so kind to Ken. His sister had been kind of like a surrogate mother to both the brothers. And when his sister, at a later age, like close to 50 years old, decided to get married and move out of Orville's house, Orville got really defensive about it and kind of, didn't have a great relationship with her up until the end. That's his dirty secret. Yeah, really kind of the only apparent blight. Now, after all of this, there is a little bit of a rivalry between two states. One of them is Ohio, because that's where the Wrights were from, and one of them is, of course, North Carolina, because that's where they first flew. And both of those states have a quarter. You know how a few years ago the United States did a state quarter, and it's on both of those quarters?
The Wright brothers?
The Wright Flyer. Yep.
Oh, that's cool. Why not?
Yeah.
Give it to them both.
Ohio's has the 1905 Wright Flyer 3, and North Carolina's has the original Wright Flyer flying in Kitty Hawk. Now, also interesting, Ohio's also has Neil Armstrong on the quarter because he was from Ohio and he was first man on the moon. And Neil Armstrong, when he went to the moon, took with him a piece of muslin from the original Wright Flyer and left it on the moon. Yeah.
Is that what you mean by people crossing paths?
They crossed paths with several presidents, including Teddy Roosevelt, during the early 1900s, who was a former person on the show. And Neil Armstrong.
I wonder if they ever met Henry Ford. They must have. Maybe.
I think they have. I think they did. Yeah, that was another one that they met. And yeah, it was just kind of amazing that these two brothers had been so single-minded for so many years, and that they were able to kind of crack the code on something that so many other bigger organizations with more funding weren't able to do.
I think what's interesting is that if you didn't know any better, you'd think that the bicycle was around for a couple hundred years, and then the car was around for 100 years, and then airplanes. But these were all within a couple of decades, that bicycles, cars, and airplanes were all kind of taken off at the same time. And like in 1880, they didn't have any, there was none of those like really prevalent. And then by 1930, there was all three everywhere.
All three very well developed. They weren't the original they weren't the original models that would barely fly. They were, they were popular and people were doing it. Yeah, no, it's amazing. And it's also amazing that from 1903 to 1969, we, in 66 years of development, we went from lying on the belly of the bottom wing, flying in the sand, to landing on the moon.
I agree. That's mind-blowing. But what's also kind of crazy is that in the 60 years since then, we haven't really advanced much farther than that at all. I mean, I guess there's been different versions of space flight, but not at the same rate for sure.
Yeah, definitely the rate of innovation has slowed down. And
we were flying at the speed of sound in the 70s and don't even do that anymore.
Oh, no, we were flying in the speed of sound in the 50s. Like Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the 1950s.
I mean, as recently as like the 1990s, we were doing that for travel, and we don't do it anymore.
With the Concorde. And
so we kind of went backwards with that. Yeah.
Well, it is very exciting, I think, these days that there is the possibility of another moon landing. There is a possibility, it seems like right now federal funding for different programs is all kind of up in the air, so who knows? But it does seem like we are on track with the Artemis program to, I believe in 2025 or 2026, orbit the moon, and then in the following year land back on the moon, which would be...
Yeah, and I'm sure SpaceX isn't going to get cut, so we're probably fine there.
Yeah, they'll fly up there and they'll have a Tesla in the belly of the thing and get it out and drive around on the moon with it.
Yep.
Well, that's Orville and Wilbur Wright, true American heroes who, were truly epitome of ingenuity, hard work, humility, and all the things that we've always valued in the United States.
Well, the Wright brothers built a plane from sticks and drums and kites. That's how I like to imagine it. When I'm at half a tank, I don't want to think. I just want to close my eyes. And I want to fly like the Wright brothers. I want to get high and lift from the ruckus. I need someone to hold on to when everything else is in doubt. 'Cause we got too many options and too many reasons to stop. Too many clocks every hour kinda looks the same. But you shake me up and lift me down and anchor me around and flow me away. Oh, I wanna fly like the Wright brothers. I wanna walk on a rope that hovers. I need a love that is strong when everything else is in doubt. Lift me up now.